The notification sound from my phone cut through the silence of our bedroom at 6:47 a.m. But it wasn't my usual alarm that woke me. It was the endless stream of Instagram notifications flooding my screen, each one more confused and sympathetic than the last. My heart stopped when I read the first comment from my sister. "Emma, I'm so sorry, I had no idea you two were having problems." I fumbled for my phone with trembling fingers, my mind racing as I tried to understand what could have prompted such a response. That's when I saw it. Marcus's latest Instagram post, uploaded just 20 minutes earlier while I was still sleeping peacefully beside him. The post that would change everything I thought I knew about my marriage, my husband, and the carefully constructed life we'd built together over the past 8 years. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The image was a perfectly staged photo of Marcus sitting alone at our kitchen table, his face strategically angled to catch the morning light streaming through our bay window. His expression was a masterpiece of calculated vulnerability, just enough sadness to appear heartbroken, but not enough to look unattractive. The caption beneath the photo read, "Sometimes love isn't enough." After much soul-searching and painful conversations, Emma and I have decided to end our marriage. I'm asking for privacy during this difficult time as we navigate this transition. Thank you for all your love and new chapter. Healing, grateful authenticity. I stared at the screen in complete shock, reading and rereading the words that announced the end of my marriage to Marcus's 3 million followers. The same marriage I'd gone to bed thinking was perfectly intact. The same marriage where we'd made love just 3 nights ago. The same marriage where we'd discussed vacation plans for next month over dinner the previous evening. My hands were shaking so violently, I could barely hold the phone as I processed what I was seeing. Marcus had not only decided we were getting divorced without consulting me, he'd announced it to the entire internet before even mentioning it to his wife. The comments section was already exploding with responses from his devoted followers, a mixture of shock, sympathy, and speculation that made my stomach churn. Influencer friends were posting heart emojis and offering their support for his brave vulnerability. Strangers were analyzing our recent photos for signs of trouble they claimed to have spotted all along. Brand partners were expressing their continued support for his authentic journey. The entire narrative of our relationship dissolution was being written in real time by people who'd never met me, based on information from a husband who apparently viewed our marriage as content for his personal brand. I turned to look at Marcus still sleeping peacefully beside me in our king-sized bed, his perfectly styled hair, somehow still camera-ready even first thing in the morning. His phone was charging on his nightstand, probably already buzzing with the engagement notifications that meant more to him than anything else in his life. The man who'd built his entire social media empire on the foundation of our seemingly perfect relationship had just destroyed that relationship with a single post, and he was sleeping through the aftermath like it was just another day at the office. My name is Emma Catherine Walsh, though most people knew me simply as Marcus's wife, the woman who appeared strategically in his lifestyle content whenever he needed to promote the image of domestic bliss that sold so well to his primarily female audience. For 8 years I'd been the supporting character in his carefully curated online narrative, the devoted spouse who made his success possible while remaining largely invisible to the millions of people who followed his every move. What his followers didn't know was that behind the scenes of Marcus's aspirational content about work-life balance and relationship goals, I was actually the primary breadwinner in our household, working as a senior data analyst for Crawford & Associates, one of Denver's most prestigious financial consulting firms. While Marcus spent his days creating content about morning routines, productivity hacks, and lifestyle optimization, I was the one paying our mortgage on the stunning downtown Denver loft that served as the backdrop for his video. I covered our health insurance, our car payments, and most of our living expenses, while Marcus reinvested his influencer income into equipment, clothing, and experiences that would generate more content. The irony wasn't lost on me that his posts about financial freedom and entrepreneurial success were subsidized by my traditional corporate salary, but I'd convinced myself that supporting his dreams was what marriage meant. Our relationship had begun 8 years ago when Marcus was still working as a marketing coordinator at a mid-sized advertising agency, before social media had consumed his identity entirely. Back then, he was charming and ambitious, with dreams of starting his own marketing consultancy and building something meaningful together. I was fresh out of graduate school with my master's in data science, excited about my new position at Crawford & Associates, and optimistic about building a life with someone who seemed to share my values about hard work and partnership. The early years of our relationship had been genuinely happy, filled with weekend adventures, intimate dinners and long conversations about our future together. Marcus was attentive and thoughtful, remembering small details about my work and celebrating my professional achievements with genuine enthusiasm. When he proposed during a hiking trip in Rocky Mountain National Park, I'd felt like the luckiest woman in the world, convinced I'd found my perfect partner for life's journey. The transformation had been gradual, so subtle that I didn't recognize it was happening until it was already complete. It started with Marcus creating an Instagram account to showcase his marketing projects, then evolved into lifestyle content when his posts about our weekend activities began gaining traction. As his follower count grew, so did his investment in maintaining his online presence. The spontaneous adventures became planned content shoots. Our private moments became opportunities for authentic storytelling. Our relationship became a brand asset to be managed and optimized. By the time Marcus quit his corporate job to pursue influencer marketing full-time, I was already financially supporting both of us while he built his audience. He'd convinced me it was a temporary arrangement, just until his income could match what he'd been making at the agency. That temporary arrangement had stretched into 3 years, during which Marcus's online success had exploded, but his actual revenue remained inconsistent and largely dependent on brand partnerships that required him to maintain his image as a successful lifestyle guru. The most painful part wasn't the financial imbalance, though that had become increasingly frustrating as Marcus spent money on designer clothes and expensive gadgets while I covered our basic living expenses. The real heartbreak was watching the man I'd fallen in love with disappear behind the carefully constructed persona he'd created for social media. Every conversation became potential content. Every experience was evaluated for its posting potential. Every aspect of our relationship was filtered through the lens of how it would appear to his audience. I'd tried to address my concerns multiple times over the past year, suggesting that we needed to have honest conversations about our financial arrangements and the way social media was affecting our relationship. Marcus always responded with the same deflection tactics, either dismissing my concerns as lack of support for his entrepreneurial journey, or promising that changes were coming once he secured the next big brand partnership. The conversations never led anywhere productive because Marcus had become incapable of engaging with reality outside the context of his online narrative. What made the divorce announcement particularly devastating was how completely it blindsided me. Just the night before, we'd been discussing plans for a weekend trip to Vail that Marcus wanted to turn into content about relationship retreats and mindful living. He'd been excited about the creative possibilities, talking about how authentic relationship content was performing well across all platforms. There had been no indication that he was planning to end our marriage, let alone announce it to the internet without my knowledge. As I lay in bed staring at the post that had apparently ended my marriage, I began to understand that Marcus had probably been planning this for weeks, maybe months. The timing wasn't accidental. Friday morning posts typically performed well for his engagement metrics, and relationship content always generated significant discussion in his comments section. He'd strategically chosen the most optimal time to announce our divorce for maximum visibility and audience engagement. The realization that my husband had treated the end of our marriage as a content marketing opportunity filled me with a rage I'd never experienced before. 8 years of my life, 3 years of financial support for his dreams, countless hours of participating in his content creation, and this was how it ended, with me finding out about my own divorce from Instagram comments while he slept peacefully beside me. I quietly slipped out of bed and made my way to our kitchen, the same kitchen where Marcus had staged his vulnerable divorce announcement photo just hours earlier. The morning light was hitting the bay window exactly as it had in his post, creating the perfect ambiance for what he'd probably calculated would be his most engaging content of the month. I sat at the table where he'd positioned himself for maximum emotional impact and tried to process the complete implosion of everything I'd thought was real about my life. The notifications on my phone continued buzzing as more and more people discovered Marcus's post and reached out with their shock and sympathy, Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Friends from college who barely kept in touch were sending concerned messages. Colleagues from work were expressing their support. Even my mother had called twice, probably panicking about why she was learning about my divorce from social media instead of from her daughter. But what disturbed me most as I scrolled through the growing comment thread was how many people were praising Marcus for his honesty and vulnerability. His female followers were particularly supportive, commenting about how refreshing it was to see a man being emotionally authentic about relationship struggles. Several verified influencer accounts had already shared supportive messages about his courage in sharing such personal news. The narrative was being written in real time, and in that narrative, Marcus was the sympathetic figure, bravely navigating a difficult life transition. None of these supporters knew that I'd learned about my own divorce from their comments. None of them understood that Marcus had made this decision unilaterally and announced it publicly before even discussing it with his wife. None of them realized that the vulnerable, emotionally authentic man they were praising had just demonstrated the most callous disregard for his partner's dignity and emotional well-being that I could imagine. As I sat in our kitchen reading comments from strangers who were more informed about my marriage status than I had been when I woke up, I began to understand that Marcus had crossed a line that went far beyond normal relationship problems. This wasn't about growing apart or falling out of love or even about the financial and emotional strain that social media had placed on our relationship. This was about a fundamental lack of respect for me as a human being, a complete disregard for basic human decency that revealed something deeply disturbing about the man I'd been married to for 8 years. The sound of Marcus's alarm going off upstairs at 7:30 a.m. cut through my spiraling thoughts. I could hear him moving around in our bedroom, probably checking his phone to see how his divorce announcement was performing in terms of engagement metrics. Within minutes, I heard his footsteps on the stairs as he made his way down to the kitchen, probably planning to create some follow-up content about his morning routine during this difficult transition. When Marcus appeared in the kitchen doorway, he was already dressed in one of his carefully selected casual outfits, his hair styled perfectly despite having just woken up. His expression was a practiced combination of vulnerability and strength, the same look he used for all his most personal content. He was carrying his phone and his professional camera, clearly prepared to document whatever conversation we were about to have for potential use in future posts about healing and growth. "Good morning, babe," he said, his voice carrying the slightly husky quality he'd perfected for his morning routine videos. "I know this is probably a shock, but I thought it was time we were honest about where we are as a couple." The post this morning was just the beginning of a conversation we should have had months ago. I stared at him in complete disbelief, struggling to process the casual way he was discussing the complete destruction of our marriage as if it was a minor scheduling conflict. The man standing in our kitchen bore no resemblance to the person I'd married 8 years ago. This was Marcus the influencer, Marcus the brand, Marcus the carefully constructed online persona who viewed every aspect of his life through the lens of content creation and audience engagement. "You announced our divorce on Instagram while I was sleeping," I said, my voice barely above a whisper as I tried to control the fury building inside me. "I found out about the end of my own marriage from comments from your followers. Do you understand how completely insane that is?" Marcus's expression didn't change as he processed my response, probably calculating how my emotional reaction could be incorporated into his narrative about the challenges of navigating relationship transitions in the public eye. "I know it seems sudden," he replied, setting his camera down on the counter in a way that suggested he might want to record our conversation. "But I've been thinking about this for a while, and I felt like being authentic with my audience was more important than maintaining a facade that wasn't serving either of us." The complete disconnect between Marcus's words and reality was so profound that I actually laughed, a bitter sound that surprised both of us. "Being authentic with your audience," I repeated, shaking my head in amazement. "You've been planning to divorce me for months and you never mentioned it to your wife, but you felt obligated to be authentic with strangers on the internet." "They're not strangers," Marcus corrected, his tone taking on the defensive edge he used whenever anyone questioned his relationship with his followers. "My audience has been part of our journey for years. They've invested emotionally in our relationship, and they deserve to know the truth about what we're going through." That's when I understood that Marcus genuinely believed what he was saying. In his mind, His social media followers had a legitimate claim to information about our private life that superseded my right to privacy and dignity as his wife. His audience's emotional investment in our relationship content had created an obligation in his mind that was more important than basic respect for his actual partner. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Marcus explaining his decision-making process as if he was discussing a business strategy rather than the end of our marriage. He'd calculated that authenticity about relationship struggles would strengthen his brand long-term, even if it meant short-term disruption to his lifestyle content. He'd consulted with his manager and several other influencers about the best way to handle the announcement. He'd even planned follow-up content about his healing journey and personal growth that would carry his audience through the transition. What he hadn't done was consider my feelings, my privacy, my dignity, or my basic right to be consulted about decisions that affected my life. In Marcus's mind, I was a supporting character in his online narrative, and supporting characters don't get to make plot decisions. They simply react to the storylines created by the main character, providing emotional depth and authenticity to whatever content strategy he'd developed. As I listened to Marcus explain his reasoning, I began to understand that our marriage had been over for much longer than I'd realized. The man I'd fallen in love with had been gradually replaced by this social media persona, who viewed everything, including our relationship, as raw material for content creation. The divorce announcement wasn't the end of our marriage. It was just the moment when I finally realized that our marriage had already ended probably years ago without my even recognizing it. But what Marcus didn't know as he outlined his post-divorce content strategy was that his decision to humiliate me publicly was about to have consequences he'd never anticipated. His social media followers might not know the truth about our relationship, but they were about to find out everything Marcus had been hiding behind his carefully curated online persona. The man who'd built his entire brand on authenticity and vulnerability was about to discover what those words actually meant. Because while Marcus had been busy planning his divorce announcement for maximum engagement, I'd been quietly documenting every aspect of our real relationship for the past year, not for social media but for my own understanding of how our marriage had deteriorated so completely. I had records of our financial arrangements, screenshots of his conversations with other women, evidence of the way he'd been manipulating situations for content, and documentation of behavior that would shatter the image he'd cultivated so carefully. Marcus thought he was controlling the narrative by announcing our divorce on his terms, but he'd just handed me the platform I needed to tell the real story. His 3 million followers were about to learn what authentic vulnerability actually looked like, and it wasn't going to be pretty for the man who'd built his entire identity on a foundation of lies and manipulation. The prey was about to become the predator, and Marcus had no idea that his carefully planned content strategy was about to become his complete destruction. Over the next few hours, as Marcus busied himself responding to comments and messages from his followers, I retreated to my home office to process what had happened and plan my next step. The room had always been my sanctuary, filled with my books, my diplomas, and the awards I'd received for my work at Crawford & Associates. It was the one space in our home that wasn't designed for social media content, the one place where I could think clearly without the constant pressure of maintaining appearance. I'd been methodically documenting our relationship problems for the past year, not because I was planning for divorce, but because I'd been trying to understand how we'd drifted so far apart. What started as personal journaling had evolved into a comprehensive record of Marcus's behavior, our financial arrangements, and the way social media had gradually consumed every aspect of our life together. I'd never intended to use this information as ammunition, but Marcus's public humiliation had changed the rules of engagement entirely. The evidence I'd collected painted a picture of our marriage that was completely at odds with the image Marcus projected online. While his followers saw a successful entrepreneur living his best life with a supportive partner, the reality was that I'd been subsidizing his lifestyle while he pursued increasingly elaborate content creation at the expense of our relationship and financial stability. The financial records alone were damning. Over the past 3 years, I'd contributed over $100 to our household expenses, while Marcus's actual income from social media averaged less than $40,000. The gap between his online success and his actual earnings was massive, sustained entirely by brand partnerships that required him to maintain the illusion of prosperity and relationship happiness. Even more revealing were the screenshots I'd saved of Marcus's conversations with other women. Not affairs exactly, but relationships that crossed every boundary of appropriate behavior for a married man. He'd been cultivating emotional connections with female followers, brand partners, and other influencers, using his marriage struggles as a way to build intimate connections with women who saw him as vulnerable and available. The pattern was consistent across dozens of conversations. Marcus would share carefully selected details about our relationship problems, position himself as a misunderstood husband trapped in an unsatisfying marriage, and gradually escalate the emotional intimacy until these women felt like they were his confidantes and potential rescuers. He'd never technically cheated, but he'd been systematically building a network of emotional affairs that provided him with the validation and attention he craved while maintaining plausible deniability. Most disturbing were the conversations where Marcus discussed his social media strategy with other influencers, revealing the calculated nature of everything he posted. Our anniversary celebrations were timed for optimal engagement. Our vacation photos were staged and edited to maximize aspirational appeal. Even our arguments were sometimes manufactured to create authentic relationship content that would drive comments and discussion. In one particularly revealing conversation with another lifestyle influencer, Marcus had explicitly discussed the pros and cons of divorce content, analyzing how other creators had successfully monetized relationship transition. He'd been researching divorce announcements for months, studying the engagement patterns and audience responses to determine the best approach for his own brand. The conversation that had convinced me to start documenting everything had occurred 6 months ago, when I'd overheard Marcus on a video call with his manager discussing the challenges of maintaining relationship content when the actual relationship was struggling. "The authentic marriage content is getting harder to create," he'd said, apparently unaware that I was listening from the hallway. "Emma's not as cooperative with filming lately, and the audience is starting to notice that our chemistry feels forced." His manager had suggested various strategies for either reinvigorating our relationship content or transitioning to divorced dad content, discussing both options as equally viable from a business perspective. They'd talked about my resistance to participating in content creation as a liability to his brand, and his manager had pointed out that divorce stories often performed better than happy marriage content because they generated more emotional engagement. That conversation had shattered my remaining illusions about Marcus's priorities and motivations. I'd finally understood that our marriage had become entirely transactional from his perspective, evaluated solely on its contribution to his social media success. When our relationship stopped being profitable content, it became expendable, but Marcus had made a critical error in his divorce announcement strategy. By humiliating me publicly without warning, he'd transformed me from a supporting character in his narrative into an antagonist with nothing left to lose. The woman who'd quietly subsidized his lifestyle and participated in his content creation was about to become the person who exposed every lie he'd built his brand upon. I spent the morning organizing my evidence into a comprehensive dossier that would systematically dismantle every aspect of Marcus's online persona. Financial records that proved his success was entirely fabricated, screenshots that revealed his emotional manipulation of female followers, documentation of the way he'd staged and manufactured content that his audience believed was authentic, evidence of his contempt for the very people who supported his lifestyle. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus's own obsession with documentation had provided much of the evidence I needed. His constant photographing and recording of our life had created a digital trail that revealed the gap between his public image and private behavior. His habit of sharing everything on social media had preserved conversations and moments that demonstrated his manipulation and dishonesty. By noon, Marcus's divorce announcement had been shared thousands of times and featured in several online publications about influencer relationships and social media authenticity. He was being praised across the internet for his courage and vulnerability, with relationship experts commenting on his mature approach to marriage dissolution and his commitment to maintaining transparency with his audience.
None of these supporters knew that Marcus had spent the morning crafting follow-up content about his emotional journey, filming segments in our bedroom where he discussed the challenges of sleeping alone and the difficulty of navigating daily routines without his partner. He was already monetizing our divorce, creating sponsored content about self-care products and therapy apps that would help him through this transition. The complete cynicism of his approach was breathtaking. Marcus was treating the end of our 8-year marriage as a business opportunity, leveraging his followers' emotional investment in our relationship to drive engagement and generate revenue. He'd transformed our private pain into public content, and he was being celebrated for his authenticity and transparency, but Marcus's celebration was premature. His decision to humiliate me publicly had just triggered a chain of events that would expose not only his lies and manipulation, but also a pattern of behavior that extended far beyond our marriage. The man who'd built his entire brand on authenticity was about to discover what real transparency looked like, because while Marcus had been busy crafting his divorce narrative, I'd been quietly investigating the financial and personal irregularities that had been troubling me for months. What I'd discovered was evidence of behavior that went far beyond emotional manipulation and social media fraud. Marcus had been systematically deceiving not just his audience and his wife, but also his business partners, brand sponsors, and financial institutions.
The prey had become the predator, and Marcus was about to learn that his carefully constructed online empire was built on a foundation that couldn't survive genuine scrutiny. His 2.3 million followers were about to discover the truth about the man they'd been supporting, and it was going to destroy everything he'd worked so hard to create. The afternoon brought a steady stream of visitors and phone calls as news of our divorce spread through our social and professional networks. Marcus handled each interaction with the same practiced vulnerability he used for his content, explaining our separation as a mutual decision based on growing apart and different life goals. He was already positioning himself as the mature, emotionally intelligent partner who was handling our divorce with grace and authenticity. What his visitors and callers didn't know was that I was recording many of these conversations from my office, documenting the way Marcus was manipulating the narrative to maintain his image while completely rewriting the actual events of our relationship. Each conversation revealed new layers of his dishonesty as he tailored his story to whatever audience he was addressing. To his male friends, he portrayed our divorce as the result of my career ambitions overwhelming our relationship. To female friends and followers, he emphasized his emotional growth and recognition that we'd both changed since getting married. To business associates, he focused on how the divorce would allow him to pursue new creative directions and authentic content that would strengthen his brand. None of these versions included any mention of his financial dependence on my income, his emotional affairs with followers, or his complete lack of consultation with me about the divorce announcement. Marcus was systematically erasing my perspective from the story while positioning himself as the sympathetic figure, navigating a difficult but necessary life transition. The most infuriating conversation I overheard was with his manager, where they discussed the potential revenue opportunities that would emerge from divorce content. They were already planning a series of posts about healing and personal growth, negotiating with therapy apps and self-help brands that wanted to sponsor his emotional journey. Marcus's divorce was becoming a multimedia content franchise before our marriage was even legally dissolved. The vulnerability factor is testing really well with focus groups, his manager explained during a video call that I recorded from the hallway outside his office. Divorced dad content has huge potential, especially if you can maintain the aspirational lifestyle elements while adding authentic emotional depth. Marcus's response revealed the complete extent of his cynicism about our relationship and his audience's emotional investment in his content. The marriage stuff was getting stale anyway, he said, apparently forgetting that his wife might be able to hear him. Emma wasn't cooperative with filming anymore, and the audience was starting to notice that our chemistry felt forced. This gives me a fresh narrative that should carry me through at least a year of content. That conversation had crossed my final line. Marcus wasn't just ending our marriage, he was treating our 8-year relationship as failed content that had outlived its usefulness. He was discussing my emotional devastation as raw material for his next creative phase, calculating how much revenue he could generate from the pain his decision had caused. But what Marcus didn't realize as he planned his post-divorce content strategy was that his conversations were providing me with evidence of systematic fraud that extended far beyond our personal relationship. His casual admissions about manufacturing authentic content, manipulating his audience's emotions, and misrepresenting his financial situation were creating a legal paper trail that would have serious consequences for his business relationships and brand partnership. The brands that sponsored Marcus's content had contracts that specifically required authenticity and truthfulness in his promotional activity. His admission that he'd been deliberately manufacturing fake relationship content to drive engagement was a material breach of those agreements that could result in massive financial penalties and legal action. More importantly, Marcus's pattern of misrepresenting his income and lifestyle to financial institutions was potentially criminal fraud. The mortgage on our downtown loft was based on income statements that included inflated estimates of his social media earnings and excluded mention of his dependence on my salary. His business loans and credit lines were secured using similar misrepresentations about his financial stability and earning potential. As evening approached and Marcus began preparing for a live Instagram session to answer questions about our divorce, I realized that his public humiliation of me had just provided the motivation I needed to expose every aspect of his fraudulent behavior. The man who'd built his entire identity on authenticity and transparency was about to face the consequences of a decade of lies and manipulation. The live session Marcus conducted that evening was a masterpiece of calculated vulnerability and audience manipulation. He positioned himself in our living room with carefully arranged lighting that emphasized his emotional state while maintaining his attractive appearance. His responses to viewer questions were perfectly calibrated to generate sympathy while maintaining his image as a mature, emotionally intelligent man navigating a difficult life transition. Throughout the 90-minute session, Marcus repeatedly emphasized how much he respected me and how our divorce was a mutual decision based on personal growth and changing life goals. He thanked his audience for their support and promised to share his healing journey with the same authenticity and transparency that had characterized all his content. None of his 47,000 live viewers knew that his respectful, grieving ex-husband persona was completely fabricated. None of them understood that he'd announced our divorce without consulting his wife or that he was already planning to monetize our separation through sponsored content and brand partnerships. But Marcus's performance was about to be interrupted by someone who knew the truth about every lie he was telling his devoted audience. The woman who'd discovered her own divorce from Instagram comments was about to give his followers a very different perspective on authenticity and emotional transparency. As Marcus wrapped up his live session with promises of continued openness about his personal journey, I was finalizing the comprehensive social media post that would expose every aspect of his deception. The prey was about to become the predator, and Marcus was about to discover that real authenticity was much more devastating than the carefully curated version he'd been selling to his audience. His 3 million followers were about to learn what their beloved lifestyle guru had been hiding behind his perfectly staged content, and it was going to destroy everything he'd built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. The morning after Marcus's live session, I woke to find him already gone from our bed, probably downstairs creating morning routine content about embracing new beginnings and personal transformation. The irony of his absence wasn't lost on me. For months he'd been filming content about the importance of presence and mindfulness in relationships while systematically checking out of our actual marriage. I could hear the familiar sounds of his content creation process, the camera clicking, furniture being moved for optimal angles, and his voice practicing different emotional inflections for maximum authenticity. What Marcus didn't know as he crafted his morning after divorce announcement content was that I'd spent the night making copies of every piece of evidence I'd collected over the past year. Financial records, screenshots of conversations, email exchanges with brands and business partners, and documentation of his systematic deception were now safely stored in multiple locations that he couldn't access or delete. The woman he'd dismissed as a supporting character in his online narrative had just armed herself with everything needed to expose the truth behind his carefully constructed empire. My phone had been buzzing all night with messages from friends, family members, and colleagues who'd seen Marcus's divorce announcement and subsequent live session. The responses fell into predictable categories: shock from people who'd believed our relationship was happy, support from those who'd suspected problems, and confusion from family members who couldn't understand why they'd learned about our divorce from social media instead of from us direct. The most painful messages came from my parents, who'd driven up from Colorado Springs the moment they saw Marcus's post. My mother's voice cracked during our phone conversation as she tried to understand how her daughter's marriage had imploded so suddenly and so publicly. "Honey, we had no idea you two were having problems," she said, her confusion evident even through the phone. Marcus always seemed so devoted to you when we visited. Are you sure this is what you want? Explaining to my parents that I'd learned about my own divorce from Instagram comments was one of the most humiliating conversations of my life. My father's silence spoke volumes about his opinion of Marcus's character, while my mother struggled to process how someone she'd welcomed into our family could treat her daughter with such callous disregard. The fact that Marcus had positioned himself as the mature, emotionally intelligent partner navigating a difficult transition made my reality even harder for them to understand. We're driving up to Denver tonight, my father finally said, his voice carrying the quiet fury that I recognized from my childhood when someone had wronged his family. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone, especially not with him treating your marriage like it's some kind of television show. My parents' reaction crystallized something I'd been struggling to articulate about Marcus's behavior. He hadn't just ended our marriage, he'd turned our divorce into entertainment for strangers, while excluding the people who actually cared about our well-being from the conversation. His 3 million followers knew more about our relationship status than my own family because Marcus valued their engagement more than our privacy and dignity. By mid-morning, I'd received calls from 3 of my closest friends who'd driven across town to check on me after seeing Marcus's announcement. Sarah, Jennifer, and Kate had been my support system through graduate school and the early years of my career, and they'd watched with growing concern as Marcus's social media obsession gradually consumed our relationship. We've been waiting for this conversation for 2 years, Sarah said bluntly as she settled into my kitchen with coffee that Kate had brought from my favorite local cafe. Marcus has been treating you like an employee in his content creation business instead of his wife. We just didn't know how to bring it up without sounding like we were attacking your marriage. Jennifer nodded grimly as she scrolled through the comments on Marcus's divorce announcement post. The way his followers are responding to this is insane, she said, shaking her head in disbelief. They're acting like they know you personally and have opinions about your relationship based on staged Instagram photos. This man has created a parasocial relationship with millions of strangers and used your marriage as the product. Kate's background in digital marketing gave her a unique perspective on Marcus's strategy and its implications. Emma, you need to understand that everything Marcus posted about your relationship was calculated for engagement, she explained, pulling up analytics tools on her laptop. The timing of posts, the emotional content, even the way he framed your role in his content, it was all designed to build audience investment that he could monetize. As my friends analyzed Marcus's social media strategy, I began to understand the full scope of how he'd exploited our relationship for financial gain. Every anniversary post, every vacation photo, every piece of content featuring our life together had been crafted to sell a lifestyle fantasy to his predominantly female audience. He'd turned our marriage into aspirational content that generated revenue through brand partnerships and sponsored posts. The most disturbing revelation came when Kate showed me the data behind Marcus's engagement pattern. His relationship content consistently outperformed everything else, she explained, pointing to graphs that tracked likes, comments, and shares over time. Posts featuring you generated 300% more engagement than his solo content. Your marriage wasn't just part of his brand, it was the foundation of his entire business model. That analysis helped me understand why Marcus had been so resistant to my request for privacy and boundaries around social media. Reducing my participation in his content would have meant a significant decrease in engagement and revenue. My discomfort with being constantly filmed and photographed wasn't just a personal preference that he could dismiss, it was a threat to his livelihood that he'd been unwilling to address honestly. The divorce announcement probably isn't the end of his relationship content, Jennifer observed, continuing to scroll through the comments and responses. He's already positioning himself as the vulnerable single man learning to navigate life after marriage. This gives him a whole new narrative to monetize. Sarah's expression grew increasingly angry as she processed the implications of what we were discussing. So he didn't just end your marriage without consulting you, she said slowly. He calculated that divorce content would be more profitable than marriage content, and made a business decision to blow up your life for better engagement metrics. The conversation with my friends confirmed what I'd been documenting for months. Marcus had systematically transformed our relationship into a business asset that he managed and optimized without my input or consent. When our marriage stopped being profitable content, he'd discarded it and moved on to the next phase of his content strategy. I wasn't his partner, I was inventory in his lifestyle brand. But what Marcus didn't realize as he filmed his morning routine content about embracing change and personal growth was that his business decision to divorce me publicly had just eliminated my motivation to protect his secret. The woman who'd quietly enabled his social media empire by providing financial stability and relationship content was about to expose every lie that empire was built on. That afternoon, while Marcus was out meeting with his manager and potential new brand partners to discuss his post-divorce content strategy, I began crafting the social media response that would systematically dismantle his carefully constructed image. Unlike Marcus's staged vulnerability, my post would contain actual authenticity, complete transparency about our financial arrangements, his emotional manipulation, and the systematic deception he'd used to build his following. The post I was preparing would include financial documents that proved Marcus's lifestyle was entirely subsidized by my corporate salary, screenshots of his conversations with other women that revealed his emotional infidelity and manipulation, evidence of his admissions that he manufactured authentic content for engagement, documentation of his contempt for the audience that supported his lifestyle. Most importantly, my response would expose the calculated nature of his divorce announcement and the complete disregard he'd shown for my dignity and privacy. His followers would learn that their beloved authenticity advocate had announced our divorce without consulting his wife, treating our 8-year marriage as failed content that had outlived its usefulness. The evidence I'd collected painted a comprehensive picture of systematic fraud that extended far beyond our personal relationship. Marcus had been misrepresenting his income to financial institutions, manipulating brand partnerships through fabricated lifestyle content, and systematically deceiving his audience about the reality of his success and relationship. But I wasn't just planning to expose Marcus's lies on social media. The evidence I'd gathered was also being prepared for submission to the relevant authorities who would investigate his business practices and financial misrepresentation. The brands that had paid him for authentic lifestyle content would learn that their partnerships were based on fabricated personas and staged authenticity. The mortgage company that had approved our loan based on his inflated income statements would discover that their risk assessments were based on fraudulent information. The tax authorities would receive documentation of the gap between his reported income and actual earnings. The social media platforms that featured him as a successful entrepreneur would learn about his systematic manipulation of audience emotions and engagement metrics. Marcus's decision to humiliate me publicly had just triggered a comprehensive exposure of every aspect of his fraudulent business practices. The man who'd built his entire identity on authenticity and transparency was about to face the consequences of a decade of systematic deception. As evening approached, I received a call from Marcus informing me that he'd be staying at a hotel for the next few days to give us both space to process our separation. The decision was presented as mutual respect for our emotional well-being, but I suspected it was actually about his content creation needs. Marcus wanted to film vulnerable single-man content without the awkwardness of having his estranged wife in the background. "I think some space will be good for both of us," he said, his voice carrying the same therapeutic tone he used for his most personal content. "This transition is difficult enough without the tension of sharing the same space while we're both processing our emotions." What Marcus didn't mention was that his hotel stay was being filmed for content about the challenges of navigating divorce and the importance of self-care during difficult transitions. His manager had probably calculated that authentic divorced man content would perform better if he was actually staying in a hotel rather than continuing to sleep in our shared bedroom. The conversation revealed how completely Marcus had compartmentalized our relationship dissolution. While I was struggling with the emotional devastation of having my marriage ended without consultation and announced to strangers, he was treating our separation as a content opportunity that required careful staging and planning. "I'll need to come by tomorrow to get some clothes and personal items," Marcus continued, probably planning to film the emotional experience of packing his belongings from our shared home. "I hope we can keep things civil for both our sake."
His request for civility was particularly galling given that he'd shown no consideration for my feelings when he announced our divorce to the internet. Marcus wanted me to maintain the same supportive, understanding demeanor that had characterized my participation in his content over the years, even as he systematically destroyed our life together for engagement metrics. But what Marcus didn't realize was that his hotel stay would provide me with the privacy I needed to finalize my comprehensive response to his divorce announcement. Without his presence in our home, I could prepare and publish the documentation that would expose every aspect of his deception without risk of interference or manipulation. That evening, I spent several hours reviewing and organizing the evidence I'd collected, ensuring that every claim I planned to make could be substantiated with documentation. Financial records, screenshots, email exchanges, and recorded conversations were arranged in a narrative that would systematically dismantle Marcus's public image while providing irrefutable proof of his systematic deception. The post I was preparing would be the antithesis of Marcus's carefully staged vulnerability. Instead of emotional manipulation designed to generate sympathy and engagement, it would contain factual documentation of behavior that would expose the gap between his public persona and private action. I decided to publish my response on multiple platforms simultaneously, ensuring that Marcus couldn't control or limit its distribution. His followers on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok would all see the documentation at the same time, making it impossible for him to craft damage control responses or manipulate the narrative before the truth was widely distributed. The timing would be calculated for maximum impact, just as Marcus had optimized his divorce announcement for engagement, but unlike his manufactured authenticity, my response would contain genuine transparency that would devastate his carefully constructed empire. As I finalized the post that would expose Marcus's systematic deception, I realized that his decision to humiliate me publicly had fundamentally changed my relationship with privacy and authenticity. For years I'd maintained my dignity by staying largely invisible in his content, supporting his success while protecting my own professional reputation and personal boundaries, but Marcus's divorce announcement had eliminated my privacy and dignity without my consent. His decision to make our relationship dissolution into public entertainment had forced me into a spotlight I'd never wanted, but now that I was there, I intended to use it to tell the truth about the man his followers had been supporting. The woman who'd discovered her own divorce from Instagram comments was about to give Marcus's audience a very different perspective on authenticity and emotional transparency. His 3 million followers were about to learn what their beloved lifestyle guru had been hiding behind his perfectly staged content. Marcus had calculated that divorce content would be more profitable than marriage content, but he hadn't considered the possibility that his ex-wife might have her own story to tell. The supporting character he'd dismissed from his narrative was about to become the protagonist in a very different kind of content, the kind that would destroy everything he'd built on lies and manipulation. The next morning brought news that Marcus's divorce announcement had been featured in several major online publications, with relationship experts and social media analysts praising his mature approach to sharing personal struggles with his audience. The articles positioned him as a pioneer in authentic influencer content, someone who was brave enough to share the difficult realities of life rather than maintaining a facade of perfection. None of these glowing profiles mentioned that Marcus had announced his divorce without consulting his wife. None of them questioned the ethics of turning relationship dissolution into content. None of them investigated the financial and emotional dynamics that had led to our separation. The narrative was being written entirely from Marcus's perspective, with journalists accepting his version of events without verification or context. The most infuriating article appeared in a major lifestyle publication under the headline, "How Marcus Walsh is Redefining Authentic Influencer Content Through Vulnerable Divorce Documentation." The piece praised his unprecedented transparency and emotional courage, suggesting that his willingness to share personal struggles would inspire other influencers to move beyond superficial content toward genuine authenticity. The article included quotes from social media experts who analyzed Marcus's strategy as a masterclass in audience engagement and brand evolution. Marcus is demonstrating that audiences crave real human experiences, one expert explained. His decision to share this difficult transition shows a level of trust with his followers that most influencers never achieve. Reading about Marcus being celebrated for his authenticity and transparency, while I dealt with the emotional devastation of his deception, was almost unbearable. The man who'd systematically lied to his audience about every aspect of our relationship was being positioned as a role model for honest content creation, but the media attention also provided me with additional motivation to expose the truth behind Marcus's carefully constructed image. His growing reputation as an authenticity pioneer would make the revelation of his systematic deception even more devastating to his brand and business relationship. I spent the morning making final preparations for my comprehensive response, scheduling the post for publication across multiple platforms at 2 p.m., exactly 48 hours after Marcus's original divorce announcement. The timing would ensure maximum visibility while giving his celebration of media attention enough time to build momentum before it was completely destroyed. The post I'd prepared was extensive and meticulously documented, beginning with a timeline of our relationship that exposed the gap between Marcus's public narrative and our private reality. Financial records would prove that his lifestyle content was subsidized by my corporate salary. Screenshots would reveal his emotional manipulation of female followers. Documentation would expose his admissions about manufacturing authentic content for engagement. Most importantly, my post would include audio recordings of Marcus discussing our divorce as a content strategy with his manager, revealing the calculated nature of his decision and his complete disregard for my emotional well-being. His followers would hear him explicitly describing our marriage as failed content that had outlived its usefulness. The evidence would be presented methodically and comprehensively, building a case that would be impossible for Marcus to refute or explain away. Unlike his emotional manipulation tactics, my response would rely on factual documentation that spoke for itself. At 1:30 p.m., I received a text from Marcus informing me that he was on his way to collect his belongings and asking if I'd prefer to be out of the house during his visit. The request was presented as consideration for my emotional comfort, but I suspected he wanted to film the experience of packing his things without having to navigate my presence or potential objection. "I'll be in my office," I replied, not mentioning that I'd be publishing my response to his divorce announcement while he gathered his camera equipment and carefully curated wardrobe from our bedroom. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus would probably discover the destruction of his public image while standing in the home that I'd been paying for throughout his social media career. As 2 p.m. approached, I could hear Marcus moving around upstairs, probably filming the emotional experience of collecting his belongings from the home he'd shared with his wife. He was creating content about the difficult realities of divorce while remaining completely oblivious to the fact that his version of reality was about to be systematically demolished. At exactly 2:20 p.m., I published my comprehensive response across Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, and Facebook simultaneously. The post began with a simple statement: "Since my husband announced our divorce to his 3 million followers before mentioning it to his wife, I thought his audience might be interested in some additional context about our relationship and his approach to authentic content creation." What followed was a methodical presentation of evidence that exposed every aspect of Marcus's deception: financial records that proved his lifestyle was subsidized by my income, screenshots that revealed his emotional manipulation of followers, documentation of his systematic manufacturing of authentic content, audio recordings of him discussing our divorce as a business strategy. The response was immediate and explosive. Within minutes, my post was being shared thousands of times as Marcus's followers discovered the truth about the man they'd been supporting. The comment section filled with shock, anger, and disbelief as people processed the evidence of his systematic deception. The notifications were coming so fast that my phone became unusable, but I could see enough to understand that Marcus's carefully constructed empire was collapsing in real time. His followers were discovering that their beloved authenticity advocate had built his entire brand on lies and manipulation.
Upstairs, I could hear Marcus's phone buzzing frantically as notifications poured in about my post. The sound of his footsteps quickened as he apparently realized that something significant was happening online. Within minutes, I heard him running down the stairs, probably panicking as he processed the scope of what I'd revealed. The prey had become the predator, and Marcus was about to discover that real authenticity was much more devastating than the carefully curated version he'd been selling to his audience. His decision to humiliate me publicly had just triggered the complete destruction of everything he'd built on a foundation of lies and manipulation. The sound of our front door slamming indicated that Marcus had fled our home, probably racing to his hotel to begin damage control efforts. But the evidence I'd presented was comprehensive and irrefutable, supported by documentation that he couldn't dispute or explain away. His 3 million followers were learning what their lifestyle guru had been hiding behind his perfectly staged content, and the revelation was destroying his reputation faster than he'd built it. The man who'd treated our marriage as failed content was about to discover that his entire career had just become a failed experiment in authenticity. Within hours of my post going live, the media narrative around Marcus's divorce announcement had completely shifted. The same publications that had praised his authentic vulnerability were now scrambling to report on the evidence of systematic deception I'd revealed. The lifestyle guru who'd been celebrated for his emotional transparency was being exposed as a fraud who'd built his empire on lies and manipulation. The audio recordings were particularly damaging to Marcus's reputation. Hearing him explicitly describe our marriage as failed content and discuss divorce announcements as engagement strategies destroyed any remaining credibility he had as an authenticity advocate. The vulnerability and emotional intelligence his followers had admired were revealed to be calculated performance designed to manipulate their emotions and generate revenue. Financial journalists were analyzing the documentation I'd provided about Marcus's income misrepresentations and their implications for his business relationship. Brand partners were quietly distancing themselves from associations with someone who'd systematically deceived audiences about the reality of his lifestyle and success. Social media platforms were reviewing his content for policy violations related to misleading advertising and audience manipulation. The influencer who'd built his career on authentic lifestyle content was facing investigations that could result in account suspensions and financial penalties, but the most devastating consequences were personal rather than professional. Marcus's female followers, who'd been particularly invested in his relationship content and divorce narrative, felt deeply betrayed by the revelation that he'd been manipulating their emotions for engagement and revenue. The comments on his recent posts shifted from sympathy and support to anger and disgust as people processed the evidence of his deception. The parasocial relationships he'd cultivated so carefully were collapsing as his audience realized they'd been emotionally invested in fabricated content designed to exploit their feelings. The trust that had taken years to build was destroyed within hours as people understood the scope of his manipulation and dishonesty. Marcus's attempts at damage control only made his situation worse. His statement claiming that my post contained misleading context and private conversations taken out of context was immediately contradicted by the comprehensive documentation I'd provided. Every claim I'd made was supported by evidence that he couldn't dispute. His manager's attempts to position the controversy as a misunderstanding between estranged spouses fell flat when journalists reviewed the audio recordings of Marcus explicitly describing his divorce announcement strategy. The business team that had celebrated his authentic vulnerability was scrambling to distance themselves from someone who'd become a liability to their other clients. The brands that had paid Marcus for lifestyle content were discovering that their partnerships were based on fraudulent representations of his success and authenticity. Legal teams were reviewing contracts and considering action to recover payments made for content that violated their agreement terms. Most importantly, the audience that had supported Marcus's career was learning that their emotional investment had been systematically exploited by someone who viewed them as revenue sources rather than genuine community members. The relationship between influencer and follower, already complicated by commercial interests, had been revealed as fundamentally dishonest and manipulative. By evening, Marcus's social media accounts had lost hundreds of thousands of followers as people abandoned someone they now understood had been deceiving them for years. The engagement metrics that had driven his business decisions were collapsing as his audience rejected the foundation of lies his content had been built on. The lifestyle guru who'd treated his wife's dignity as collateral damage in his content strategy was discovering that authenticity couldn't be manufactured or staged. Real transparency was devastating his carefully constructed empire faster than any algorithm could optimize content for engagement. Marcus's decision to announce our divorce without consultation had been calculated for maximum social media impact, but he'd never considered the possibility that his victim might have her own platform and evidence to present. The supporting character he'd dismissed from his narrative had just become the protagonist in the story of his complete downfall. The woman who'd discovered her own divorce from Instagram comments had given his 3 million followers a very different perspective on authenticity and emotional transparency. The truth about Marcus Walsh was spreading faster than any of his staged vulnerability content ever had. And it was destroying everything he'd built on manipulation and lie. 3 days after my post exposed Marcus's systematic deception, the consequences were cascading through every aspect of his personal and professional life with devastating efficiency. The man who'd built his entire identity around authenticity and transparency was facing the complete collapse of his career, reputation, and financial stability. The most immediate impact was financial. Brand partnerships that had generated the majority of Marcus's actual income were being terminated as companies distanced themselves from someone who'd systematically deceived audiences about the nature of sponsored content. The lifestyle guru who'd promoted everything from productivity apps to luxury travel experiences was no longer a viable marketing partner for brands that valued authenticity and consumer trust. Legal action was following close behind the commercial consequence. 3 major brands had already filed suit against Marcus for breach of contract, claiming that his systematic misrepresentation of his lifestyle and relationships constituted fraud that invalidated their partnership agreement. The documentation I'd provided was being used as evidence that Marcus had knowingly deceived his audience and business partners about fundamental aspects of his content. The mortgage company that had approved our home loan based on Marcus's inflated income statements was initiating an investigation into potential fraud that could result in criminal charges. Financial institutions that had extended credit based on his social media success were discovering that their risk assessments had been based on fabricated information about his actual earning capacity. Tax authorities were reviewing Marcus's filings after being provided with evidence of the gap between his reported income and actual earning. The lifestyle content that had portrayed him as a successful entrepreneur was being scrutinized by investigators who specialized in social media fraud and tax evasion. But the personal consequences were even more devastating than the financial and legal ramifications. Marcus's remaining followers were sharing their own stories of how his content had influenced their relationship expectations and financial decisions, creating a growing narrative about the real-world harm caused by his systematic deception. Women who'd used Marcus's relationship content as a model for healthy partnerships were discovering that their aspirations had been based on fabricated interactions designed to generate engagement rather than genuine emotional connection. The lifestyle choices they'd made based on his financial advice were proving unsustainable because his apparent success had been entirely subsidized by my corporate salary. The parasocial relationships Marcus had cultivated were revealing their darker implications, as people processed how deeply they'd been manipulated by someone who viewed their emotional investment as a business resource. Support groups were forming online for people who felt betrayed by influencers who'd systematically deceived their audiences about fundamental aspects of their lives. Marcus's attempts to rehabilitate his image were failing spectacularly as each new statement or video was immediately contradicted by additional evidence that emerged from his years of documented deception. His claim that our relationship problems were private matters was undermined by his own decision to make our divorce into public content without my consent. His manager had abandoned him after the scope of his deception became clear, apparently concerned about the liability associated with representing someone facing multiple fraud investigations. The talent agency that had been negotiating book deals and speaking engagements was quietly removing Marcus from their roster of clients. The social media platforms that had featured Marcus as a successful content creator were reviewing his account for policy violations related to misleading advertising and audience manipulation. His verification status was under review, and several platforms were considering account suspension pending investigation of his systematic deception practices. Most tellingly, Marcus's own family was struggling to process the revelation of his character and behavior. His parents, who'd been proud of their son's apparent success and seemingly happy marriage, were having difficulty reconciling the public exposure of his manipulation and dishonesty with the person they thought they knew. His sister had called me directly to apologize for Marcus's behavior and express her shock at learning about the way he'd treated our marriage and announced our divorce. "We had no idea he was capable of something like this," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "The way he humiliated you publicly while pretending to be respectful and mature, it's not the brother we thought we knew." The conversation with Marcus's sister revealed that his deception had extended to his own family, who'd believed his public persona was genuine rather than a carefully constructed performance designed to generate revenue. They were processing their own sense of betrayal as they understood how completely he'd manipulated everyone who cared about him. But perhaps the most significant consequence was the broader conversation my exposure of Marcus's deception had sparked about influencer culture and the ethics of monetizing personal relationships. Media outlets were using our situation as a case study in the potential for abuse when private life becomes public content without the consent of everyone involved. Relationship experts were discussing the implications of social media culture for authentic partnership, questioning how genuine emotional connection could survive when every interaction was evaluated for its content potential and audience engagement. The conversation was expanding beyond Marcus's individual behavior to examine systemic issues with influence marketing and audience manipulation. Academic researchers were analyzing my documentation as evidence of how social media platforms and advertising systems incentivized deceptive content that prioritized engagement over authenticity. Marcus's systematic manipulation of his audience was being studied as an example of how commercial interests could corrupt genuine human connection and emotional vulnerability. The Federal Trade Commission was reviewing Marcus's sponsored content for compliance with disclosure requirements, particularly given the evidence that his lifestyle representations were fundamentally dishonest. The investigation could result in significant financial penalties and requirements for corrective advertising that would further damage his reputation. Meanwhile, I was dealing with the personal aftermath of exposing someone I'd been married to for 8 years. While the public response had been overwhelmingly supportive, the emotional toll of having my private life scrutinized by millions of strangers was considerable. The privacy I'd fought to protect throughout Marcus's career was permanently gone, sacrificed to expose his systematic deception. But the support I'd received from unexpected sources was helping me process the trauma of Marcus's betrayal and public humiliation. Other women who'd been deceived by partners who prioritized social media success over genuine relationship reached out to share their stories and offer solidarity. Professional opportunities were emerging from the visibility my response had generated. Organizations focused on digital literacy and social media ethics were inviting me to speak about my experience and the broader implications of influencer culture for authentic relationship and personal integrity. Crawford & Associates had been completely supportive throughout the controversy, recognizing that my experience and the attention it had generated made me a valuable resource for understanding how social media deception could impact financial institutions and business relationships. The most meaningful support came from Marcus's former followers who'd taken time to understand the evidence I'd presented and were working to rebuild their own relationships and financial decisions based on more authentic foundation. Their messages of gratitude and solidarity reminded me that exposing Marcus's deception had prevented him from continuing to manipulate and exploit people who'd trusted him. A week after my post went live, Marcus made his final attempt to control the narrative by publishing a lengthy statement acknowledging mistakes in judgment while continuing to minimize the scope of his deception. The response was immediately criticized as insufficient and manipulative, particularly his characterization of systematic fraud as mere mistakes in judgment. His attempt to position himself as someone who'd simply made errors while trying to build his career was contradicted by the overwhelming evidence of calculated manipulation and deliberate deception that had been documented over years of systematic behavior. The statement included no acknowledgement of the way he'd humiliated me by announcing our divorce without consultation, no apology for the emotional manipulation of his audience, and no recognition of the financial fraud he'd committed against business partners and institutions. The inadequate response sealed Marcus's fate as someone who remained committed to manipulation and deception even after being comprehensively exposed. The final attempt at damage control actually increased the criticism he was facing by demonstrating his continued lack of genuine remorse or understanding of his behavior. Within days of his statement, Marcus's remaining social media accounts were suspended for policy violations related to misleading advertising and audience manipulation. The platforms that had enabled his deception for years were finally taking action to prevent him from continuing to exploit his remaining followers. The lifestyle guru who'd built his empire on fake authenticity had lost his platform, his audience, his business relationships, and his reputation. The man who'd treated his wife's dignity as collateral damage in his content strategy was facing the complete destruction of everything he'd built through lies and manipulation. But most importantly, the conversation my exposure had sparked was helping other people recognize similar patterns of deception and manipulation in their own relationships and social media consumption. The painful revelation of Marcus's systematic fraud was preventing other people from being exploited by those who prioritized engagement and revenue over genuine human connection. The woman who'd discovered her own divorce from Instagram comments had transformed her personal trauma into a broader educational moment about authenticity, consent, and the ethics of turning private life into public content. The supporting character Marcus had dismissed from his narrative had become the protagonist in a story about standing up to manipulation and demanding genuine transparency. Marcus Walsh's career as a lifestyle influencer was over, destroyed by the very authenticity he'd claimed to value but never actually practiced. The man who'd built his success on lies about love, relationships, and personal growth had learned that real truth was much more powerful than any manufactured vulnerability he could stage for social media engagement. 6 months after exposing Marcus's systematic deception, I stood in the conference room of Morrison & Associates, the prestigious PR firm that had hired me as their new director of digital ethics and authenticity. The irony wasn't lost on me that my experience as the victim of social media manipulation had transformed into a career helping organizations navigate the complex landscape of influencer partnerships and authentic marketing strategy. The meeting I was leading involved representatives from 3 major brands that had been burned by deceptive influencer partnerships, including 2 companies that had previously worked with Mark. They were seeking guidance on how to identify and prevent similar fraud in their future marketing campaigns, recognizing that my unique perspective as someone who'd lived with a systematic deceiver gave me insights that traditional marketing professionals couldn't provide. The challenge isn't just identifying current deception, I explained to the assembled executives, pointing to a presentation slide that analyzed engagement patterns and authenticity indicators. It's understanding how sophisticated these manipulation strategies have become, and building verification systems that can detect fabricated, lifestyle content before it damages your brand reputation. The past 6 months had been a whirlwind of unexpected opportunities and personal growth that I never could have anticipated when I first discovered Marcus's divorce announcement on Instagram. What had started as the worst betrayal of my life had evolved into a platform for helping others avoid similar exploitation and manipulation. My expertise in data analysis, combined with my intimate knowledge of how influencer fraud operated, had made me a sought-after consultant for brands, agencies, and even federal investigators who were examining social media deception and its economic impact. The woman who'd been dismissed as a supporting character in Marcus's narrative had become a leading voice in the conversation about digital authenticity and consumer protection. The legal proceedings against Marcus had concluded the previous month with settlements that effectively ended any possibility of his return to social media influence. The fraud charges related to his mortgage and business loan applications had resulted in criminal penalties that included restitution payments and probation conditions that prohibited him from engaging in social media marketing activity. But beyond the legal consequences, Marcus had become a cautionary tale within the influencer community about the dangers of prioritizing engagement over authenticity. Business schools were using our case study to teach students about ethics in digital marketing and the long-term costs of deceptive business practice. The most satisfying aspect of my new career was the direct impact I could have on preventing other people from experiencing what Marcus had put me through. Working with social media platforms to develop better detection systems for fraudulent content,
consulting with brands on authentic partnership strategies, and speaking at conferences about the hidden costs of influencer manipulation, gave meaning to the trauma I'd endured. My personal life had stabilized in ways that reflected hard-earned wisdom about authenticity and genuine connection. Dating remained complicated by my public profile and the scrutiny that came with being known as the woman who'd exposed Marcus Walsh, but I'd developed relationships with people who valued privacy and authenticity over social media performance. The downtown Denver loft that had served as the backdrop for Marcus's lifestyle content had been sold, with the proceeds allowing me to purchase a modest home in a quiet neighborhood where I could live without constantly being reminded of his deception. The space was truly mine, decorated according to my preferences rather than optimized for content creation. Financial independence had taken on new meaning after years of subsidizing Marcus's fraudulent lifestyle. My salary at Morrison & Associates, combined with consulting income and speaking fees, had given me security that wasn't dependent on anyone else's career decisions or authentic performance. The lesson about never again allowing someone to exploit my financial stability while pursuing their own dreams had been permanently learned. The broader conversation about influencer culture that my exposure of Marcus had sparked continued to evolve in directions that gave me hope for positive change. Social media platforms were implementing stronger verification requirements for lifestyle and relationship content. Brands were developing more sophisticated methods for evaluating the authenticity of potential partners. Consumers were becoming more skeptical of aspirational content that seemed too perfect to be genuine. Academic research was documenting the psychological impact of parasocial relationships with deceptive influencers, leading to increased awareness of how social media manipulation could affect mental health and relationship expectations. The work being done to protect vulnerable audiences from exploitation felt like a meaningful legacy from the painful experience Marcus had put me through. Marcus himself had largely disappeared from public view after his social media bans and legal settlement. Occasional reports suggested he was working in traditional marketing roles under closer supervision, but his career as a lifestyle influencer was permanently over. The man who'd built his identity around social media success had been forced to rebuild his life without the platform that had defined him for so many years. His former followers had moved on to other influencers, but many had reported being more skeptical of lifestyle content and more aware of the potential for manipulation in aspirational social media. The education they'd received through Marcus's exposure was helping them make more informed decisions about who to trust and support online. The relationship experts and social media analysts who'd initially praised Marcus's divorce announcement, authenticity had quietly revised their perspectives, acknowledging that their initial analysis had been based on incomplete information. The incident had sparked important conversations within their fields about the need for more thorough investigation before endorsing influencer behavior as exemplary. My own relationship with social media had evolved to prioritize genuine connection over performance or image management. I maintain professional accounts related to my consulting work, but personal sharing was limited to close friends and family through private channels. The lesson about protecting privacy and maintaining boundaries between public and private life had been learned at considerable cost. The most meaningful outcome of exposing Marcus's deception was the community of people who'd connected over similar experiences with manipulative partners or deceptive social media figures. Support networks had formed to help others recognize warning signs and recover from relationships where their reality had been systematically distorted for someone else's benefit. Speaking engagements at universities and conferences had given me opportunities to educate young people about healthy relationship dynamics and the importance of maintaining authentic connections in an increasingly digital world. The feedback from these presentations suggested that sharing my experience was helping others avoid similar exploitation. The book deal I'd signed with a major publisher would allow me to reach an even broader audience with the story of Marcus's deception and the lessons learned about authenticity, manipulation, and recovery. The memoir would provide detailed analysis of how sophisticated social media fraud operated and practical guidance for protecting oneself from similar exploitation. Research collaboration with academic institutions was contributing to a growing body of knowledge about the psychology of social media deception and its impact on relationships and financial decision-making. The data I'd collected during my marriage to Marcus was proving valuable for understanding how influencer fraud developed and operated over time. The Federal Trade Commission had implemented new guidelines for social media disclosure, partly based on evidence from Marcus's case, requiring more transparent identification of sponsored content and clearer distinction between authentic personal sharing and commercial promotion. The regulatory changes would help protect consumers from the kind of systematic deception Marcus had practiced. As I concluded my presentation to the brand executives and answered their questions about identifying authentic influencer partnerships, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since that morning when I discovered my divorce from Instagram comments. The trauma of Marcus's betrayal had been transformed into expertise that was helping others avoid similar exploitation. The woman who'd been dismissed as a supporting character in someone else's social media narrative had become a leading advocate for authenticity and consumer protection in digital marketing. Marcus's decision to prioritize engagement over human dignity had ultimately created the conditions for meaningful change in how society understood and regulated influencer culture. Walking back to my office after the successful presentation, I felt genuinely grateful for the unexpected direction my life had taken. The path through betrayal and public humiliation had led to work that felt meaningful and relationships that were based on genuine connection, rather than performance for external validation. Marcus had taught me through his systematic deception and ultimate betrayal what authentic vulnerability actually looked like. It wasn't staged emotional content designed to generate engagement. It was the courage to tell the truth about painful experiences in order to help others avoid similar harm. The divorce announcement that had devastated me 6 months ago had ultimately freed me from a relationship built on lies and manipulation, creating space for a life based on genuine authenticity and meaningful connection. Marcus's greatest act of cruelty had accidentally become the catalyst for my transformation into someone who could help others protect themselves from similar exploitation. The lifestyle influencer who'd treated his wife's dignity as collateral damage in his content strategy had inadvertently created an expert in social media deception, whose work would prevent countless others from experiencing similar betrayal. The supporting character he'd dismissed had become the protagonist in a story about standing up to manipulation and demanding genuine transparency in an increasingly deceptive digital world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.